Для начала, даже не в спекулятивных целях, и не в целях каких-то провокативных.
Not for provocative purposes, but I would like to say, and start with my basic thesis, which is that the seemingly new world order, which is often called post-order, quite distinct to the mainstream vision, does not exist. There is no post-order. There is just old order, there is no post-truth, there is no hybrid war, there is no post-West. A hybrid war term, which is believed to be a new term. And if we look at the history of wars with hindsight, we will see that any war is a hybrid war. Any war is using very different means, including propaganda, lies, sabotage, attempts to subvert the population in the enemy country. And when we speak about post-truth, we mean that this is the lies of a populist politician. Well, apparently, in a way, lies have always been widely and broadly used by politicians, and there is nothing new in this. In Russia, we live in a post-truth world, starting from the Soviet Union or even the pre-revolutionary Russia. So, unfortunately, in this sense, lies have been used as an instrument in politics for ages immemorial. Now, the post-West. Post-West, post-order, with and I refer to very vogue phrases, as it appears that there's a shift in the paradigm. But there's no post-West, because the West is still there, and the value configuration of the West is exactly there. Even if we take the example of Mr. Trump, who has been elected as they say, a post-order president, but when indeed confronted with the reality, he had to step back, as the American system of checks and balances and the division of powers made him from a game changer into an almost standardized or somewhat standardized American figure. So when confronted with this, he had to take into account the so-called collective West, and the American democracy, however it may be on his way, is still impeding him in some of his craziest motives. 3 years ago, a famous book by Henry Kissinger was published, where the classic of the world diplomacy argued very conclusively that there hardly was any unified notion of the world order, so that every civilization in the history of mankind always had its own somewhat different version of the world order. And the same can be said about the Euro-Atlantic idea. So I don't think that any attempts to call post-order or post-truth are in any way meaningful. I think that these are rather symptoms of the impotence of politicians, analysts, us, journalists, the so-called intellectuals, those who find themselves powerless in explaining the things around us. And my main thesis is that the Western order, or that order which was formed after World War II, continues to exist. In 1989, the famous article by Francis Fukuyama then was transformed into the End of History book. Mr. Fukuyama was broadly criticized for killing the history way before it died. Well, one may argue that the post-war history ended in 1989, but the new history started within pretty much along the lines of the same order. The West did not go beyond the horizon, and many years after Oswald Spengler, it is still hovering above the horizon. So what we're seeing is we should probably not be too much intent on futurology. Then 8 years after Mr. Fukuyama, Fareed Zakaria published another article in which he introduced the term of neoliberal democracy, which is also a term often used and calling the illiberal democracy movements. That article by Fareed Zakaria was ended with the words that the task of the future generations to make the world safe for democracy, but today's task, and this was 1997, 20 years ago, our today's task is to make democracies safe for the world. Even then, some of the sensitive intellectuals could sense that something was changing around them. But I think there is one other linguistic trap here with this illiberal democracy term. When one of the modern political scientists attempted to describe the processes that we're seeing in Europe and in the States with the self-assertion of these illiberal democracies, he called these illiberal response to the non-democratic liberalism. Well, this is an interesting description. It may describe something, but an illiberal response cannot be democratic. In what sense? The populism arrives at the scene. It sweeps, be it left or right-wing populism, but populism is not about democracy. Hitler was a populist, Mussolini was a populist, Franco was a populist, Lenin was a populist, Mr. Putin has been, continues to be, and will be a populist. Navalny is a populist in some way. So let us just call this post-populism, which is yet another unfounded way to call to this. But this has nothing to do with democracy. Democracy, in my view, and this may be a somewhat provocative thesis to some, but democracy presupposes liberalism and vice versa. And in today's world, to sever this duo is not possible. And wrong, outright wrong. The word of populist has become just as widespread and pejorative as fascist. So the word of fascist or Bandera champion is one of the staples of the modern Russian propaganda. And the same is about populists. You may remember that there was a report which I have not read, which was published, and I'm not going to read it. I just know about its content. It was the report from the Russian presidential office. The report directed against Mr. Navalny. Now, populist is a bad word in the Russian parlance, political parlance today, which is, of course, strange because a classical populism is Mr. Putin. This is an embodiment of populism in all material or immaterial aspects. So, in some preventive ways, this term has been used against his opponent. Well, apparently the political purpose of Mr. Putin is to become the president of the populist United States and populist states of Europe. But apparently this was defeated this year because the populism that the West is very much wary of and that the political class in Russia rests its hope to, started with an anti-populist wave. The populists lost in the Netherlands. We think that Marine Le Pen may well lose in the second tour. Let me be cautious about it. The populists lost in Austria. The populists in Poland, who are in power, are still confronting great anti-populist sentiment. A democratic way, and indeed the movement which takes thousands of people to rally in the streets. In Hungary, the populists in power, however I call them, have also encountered great resistance with relation to the Central European University. So when the situation is a lot more complex than it may seem, and certainly very far from the triumph of populism. This populism of the new historical kind does not seem to have any pronounced political program because it is primarily an anti-movement, anti-EU, anti-immigration, anti-Euro, in the same way as the Russian populism is also an anti. It's the fortress mentality. It's the citadel mentality. It's the mentality as that we're being attacked, and so we are in the constant defense. We are being constantly insulted. We're insulted as the Russian Orthodox. We're insulted as the Chechens. We are insulted by 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so we are acting against those who insult us. So yet again, this is a populism based on the anti-rhetoric. In the both Russian and Western populism is a very interesting dimension. This is anti-Soros. Virtually all populist politicians say that Mr. Soros is undermining the foundations of democracy. This is what we see in Russia, which was indeed the first to exile Mr. Soros institutions, and of course Russia continues to be the vehement anti-Soros in all cities. And well, the school, Moscow School of Civic Education, is also one of the great monuments to the anti-Soros campaign. The Balkan states and Hungary are other examples, even in Romania, where there were two waves confronting each other in the streets. The government, which is generally speaking, not particularly populist, as much as we know, but that government did not find anything better but to say that the people went to the streets of Bucharest paid by Mr. Soros. A very simple explanation, really. So I think that we have we have to follow Mr. Putin's symptoms, and I think we will yet see more and more examples of how the name of Mr. Soros and the Western money spring up. Yesterday, that Открытая Россия cannot be as they say, the undesirable organization because it's a Russian and not a foreign organization. So we're seeing these convulsions every day. And as to our starting point, which is the global situation in the world with this populism and anti-populism, let me repeat myself, is that it's not as easy as it may seem. The institutional insurance or the institutional system of democracy is still up and running. It is still strong. And I have to say that these have been published in the materials of the Munich conference. Most EU states, including the so-called right-wing populist governments, are pro-Europe, are for NATO to continue to be a safeguard. And indeed, the West has frightened itself beyond measure with the Russian ghost threat. And so in this way, the public opinion is still quite strongly in favor of the Western values. So the refugees are still going and willing to go into Europe rather than because Europe is still seen as the center of gravitation, the social services, state services, food in abundance, education and healthcare. You may not remember Dmitry Prigov, the Russian satirical poet, who said that he was saying that people indeed are still fleeing to the west and not to the east. And so it is a lot more sensible to face and indeed orient oneself towards the Western Europe rather than Turkmenistan. I think there is not much doubt about this. And even though there's a lot of anti-movement, there are some precepts and tenets which have stayed quite inviolable. And I'm sure that let me remember all the Schadenfreude in Russia related in Russia after the terrorist attacks in Belgium and in France. And indeed, we have in this communitarian public opinion. We don't have many migrants. We don't have as much terrorism as there is in the West. Well, it really ricocheted very painfully against Russia. And of course, the complexities will not go away. They will not go away with the problems that we're seeing with the Russian nationalism and even the Russian fascism in quite the same way as in Europe. So whatever they say about the so-called sovereign democracy, they cannot deal away with the problems which are faced by everybody in the world.
And this thin red line, it's when the population of Europe, huge wave on top, which is still growing. By 2050, that is the population of Asia. Although Asia is seeing all kinds of processes in many ways, it becomes economically self-sufficient, but the substantial part of this wave will seep through the borders, and this thin red line will be filled with people of other blood. And this will happen, this will take place. If the Western civilization can come up with the answers to these challenges, then these processes will take part relatively peacefully. We see how the Western civilization is seeking to come up. Of course, you can criticize Merkel for being so benevolent towards the migrants, so therefore failing the concept of multiculturalism. And I'm not sure that multiculturalism has failed, for the simple reason that from the very start it was pretty vulnerable. People traveled to Europe to live in safety and security, not in order to share Western values. Yes, some of them assimilate in this environment and become westernized. It's interesting to trace what has been taking place with the Turkish immigration to Germany. When many years ago, the first generations of migrants sought to fit into the Western civilization, Western way of life, whereas their grandchildren start to do kamikaze attacks or just drive the lorries and try to run over people. This can happen anyways. I'm not speaking about any geographical. It can happen anywhere, in a city, town, or a village. The same prospects are faced by Russia. The point of my presentation is that it's too early for us to A, bury the old world order. B, is that we should keep a close eye on tracks that look different ways and not seek to extrapolate what we see now into the future, not necessarily what we see now. And to be completely honest, and no analyst can be like trying to guess the future. And in this very complicated word,